Hey guys, Mr. Ridgway here, and we are finally ready for World War II. This lesson will kind of break my heart here a little bit because we only have 2 days to discuss it. So in our DCUSH class, we're going to attempt to go into as much depth as we possibly can and see what we can indeed conquer. Let's get started. So what we're going to be looking at here in this lesson is the decisions that U.S. leaders are making strategic wise, in the years 1941 to 1943. So we're only going to really deal, or 1939 and 1943. So we're really only going to deal with really the first, 4 years of World War II. Now again, this kind of depends on when you decide that World War II actually begins. Some people say it actually begins all the way back in 1939. Some say it's not until 1941 when the United States is fully involved, and then it truly does become a world war. Again, doesn't really matter here. We're going to be looking at the strategery of everything that's going on behind the U.S. decisions. Okay, so the U.S. in World War II, 1941 to 1943, and actually that should be said 1939 to 1943. I'll have to go back and fix that. Anyways, so we're going to look at how do countries involve themselves in overseas conflicts, and then also how do nations balance military stuff that's going on overseas, okay, with the politics that's going on at home. And as you'll see here, especially from 1939 to 1941, the U.S. is really going to, at least FDR is really going to have to very, very carefully negotiate and balance those two things. So the U.S. being involved. Okay, World War II officially, starts in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland. Okay, and then from that point on, kind of the Sitting War or the Sitzkrieg, and then the invasion of France, and a couple other things. Okay, but the U.S. will not get all the way to being involved until 1941. So really, what happens in those 2 years in between? And again, because this is a dual credit U.S. history course, we're really kind of looking at the U.S. perspective here. So FDR, when he is looking at all these things happening overseas, basically he knows and acknowledges that the U.S. is going to have to play at least an instrumental part in the conflict that is, as he sees it, pretty much is going to happen, and the U.S. at some point is going to get involved in. So he's also trying to get the U.S. ready, but at the same time, he has to be very cautious of the feeling that most Americans have at the time, and that's kind of an isolationist sentiment that had been going on really since World War I, and even in many cases beforehand, with the anti-imperialist leagues. So he is trying to kind of carefully walk this line between trying to get the U.S. ready, but then also at the same time acknowledge the feelings that many Americans had that they really didn't want to involve themselves in another world war. So FDR begins to kind of push back on some of the laws that had kind of isolated the U.S. or attempted to isolate the U.S. Before its involvement in World War II. These were called Neutrality Acts. There was actually several of them that get passed in 1933, 34, 35, and I think maybe another one in 37. But he starts to have the U.S. begin to support certain sides, Britain most notably, kind of in the background of things. So there were 2 policies in particular we're going to take a look at here, which is Lend-Lease and Cash and Carry. Okay, so Lend-Lease was a bill that FDR kind of put forward that basically what would happen is that the U.S. would lend some World War I destroyers to Britain for them to use. Now, lend completely here meant that the U.S. had no expectation of ever getting these things back. World War II, at least early on, from 1939 to 1941 especially, was really dominated by the struggle of Britain to keep getting supplies while in the midst of submarine warfare. U.S. giving destroyers out to go and sink subs, they're not really having an expectation that they're going to get these things back. They know that many of the ships might either be sunk or they're just going to become pretty much old and unusable by that time. Cash and Carry is a little bit different. So instead of just lending people armaments, Cash and Carry kind of turns the U.S. into a gun and weapons provider, but as long as other countries come and buy them and then transport them themselves. So again, like the whole theme here is that FDR is trying to supply countries that are involved in the war effort, Britain, without getting the U.S. too directly involved in something like a Lusitania type of event where the U.S. is, directly transporting weapons and stuff like that. Okay, cool. So now let's talk about Japan and Pearl Harbor. So in the background of all this, of Lend-Lease and cash and carry, and then Roosevelt trying to kind of balance against the forces of isolationism, Japan had actually started expanding their territory overseas. Now, Japan, after World War I, had really been kind of bitter about the outcome of that in terms of how much territory they got for being on the side of the Triple Entente. And so in 1933, they actually invade China and start to set up basically puppet states like Manchuria and Manchuria. And despite all that, the U.S. is not really too much of a fan. But there's not really too much here that the United States can do. So when looking at this specific theater, the big thing that you need to understand is that as Japan starts to grab more territory out in the Pacific, so this way, right, grab more territory out in the Pacific and starts to kind of eat its way across the specific islands, the U.S. starts to put in place oil embargoes. Okay, and oil at this time, because that's what navies operated off of, is a really, really big deal. And so when the United States starts to put in trade and oil embargoes in place, Japan basically decides from this point that it knows that it's going to have to eliminate the U.S. Basically militarily in order to expand. So basically, summarizing here, quite a few years here of history, Japan starts planning a surprise attack. It takes several years of planning, but they finally decide that they're going to attack on a Sunday early in the morning, kind of during church time at Pearl Harbor, which is the main U.S. Navy base in Hawaii. So what they do is they show up. There's really two waves of attack, and they pretty much destroy the entire U.S. surface fleet, with the exception of a few aircraft carriers, which is really important because aircraft carriers are going to become the real naval power in World War II, and we will get to more on that here in a little bit. However, the whole point here was to cause the United States to sue for peace, but because the aircraft carriers survive, that doesn't exactly happen, and Japan was hoping at this surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, again with no warning, that they were hoping that not only would this give them time to expand and conquer, but it would just really take the U.S. out of the equation, and that obviously didn't happen because the United States gets pretty darn angry, and once that train starts rolling, as the planner of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor said, Yamamoto, he said, I have great confidence for the first couple of years, but then 3 to 4 years on, I'm going to start being really worried. And I'm basically paraphrasing there, but that's basically what he said. Okay, so from that point on, the U.S. is fully invested in the war. FDR goes to Congress. Congress, I think with the exception of one vote, declares war. And then a very, very important meeting happens, and that's with Winston Churchill and FDR. So Winston Churchill is the leader of Great Britain, and so now it is basically what's kind of alliance-wise happened is we have the Axis powers, which are Japan, Germany, and Italy, and then versus Britain, Russia, and United States. Okay, now Russia will get there a little bit later too. But this meeting between two of those allies, Britain and the United States, is really, really important. So when they meet on a basically a cruise ship, and then kind of go to a couple other places. This Atlantic Charter's really, really important because it basically says okay, here's what the United States and Britain are going to attempt to do. Here's our goals, and they basically in this charter say that the United States and Britain are going to focus on defeating Germany first, while staying on the defensive against Japan. And then once Germany is defeated, they'll turn their full attention over to Japan and defeat it. And this actually makes a whole lot of sense for a couple of reasons. Number one, Britain is the only ally left in Europe. And you don't exactly just want to play defensive against Germany over there, because if you lose like Great Britain, it's going to be much, much harder to take back over Europe without like using Britain as a launching point. Now, also, it was much more difficult for Japan to actually take the entire Pacific Ocean than it was, I guess, Germany to take over Britain. Okay, so this strategically makes a whole lot of sense. Now, do you agree? Maybe you like this doesn't make any sense at all. You know, most Americans, this might have seemed pretty difficult considering that most Americans were probably pretty angry at Japan, thinking they should be taken out first. So, do you agree with the U.S.'s strategy? Why or why not? So, despite your feelings on it, let's talk about now kind of how the war is going to develop. So in the first couple years of the war, the leader of Russia, his name was Joseph Stalin, he had been pushing for the Allies, Britain and the United States, to open up a second front on Germany. And that's because, if you didn't know, during World War II, Germany makes the same decision that they did in World War I, that they're going to invade Russia. Okay, and so Stalin is basically, for the first couple years after the Germans invade in Operation Barbarossa, is kind of getting his butt kicked. And he would really like some relief from all of the attention that Germany has been putting on him. But the United States and Britain are really, really hesitant to invade Europe, basically because it takes a lot of time to not only train troops and get materiel organized to, like, you know, get an invasion in place, but then also, like, not only time, like most of like troops of the Allies in World War II really hadn't had a lot of combat up until that point, especially the United States. It's kind of a complicated situation. And the United States and Britain, despite being hesitant, both Stalin and their own people want the Allies to start doing something. So they basically do three minor fronts. They're going to do air bombing raids over Japan, air bombing raids over Germany, which we can talk about in length. I would love to talk about more, but there's just a incredible amount of bombing raids that go on into some really, really deep parts of Europe that are super risky and super interesting, and you should go check out more on them. But we're specifically going to look at North Africa, which is Operation Torch, and the invasion of Italy, which is Operation Avalanche. Okay. So Operation Torch in North Africa, and we can actually see this down here on this map. So in late 1941, I know it says, 1942, I need to correct that. In late 1941, the U.S. troops and British troops actually invade North Africa, and that is simply, they do this because the Germans are there. Okay, there's Axis troops there. Mostly it was Italians, but then eventually also becomes backed up by Germans. The thing here is that, like, North Africa really doesn't matter that much, except for being able to send ships through the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so there's not a whole lot of strategic significance. There's also not a lot of casualties. The big thing here is that North Africa and Operation Torch gives U.S. troops and other, the Brits and the French, time to actually learn how warfare works in World War II, especially with the idea of tanks and air power and all the changes that have happened since World War I. Okay, now Italy's a little bit different. Okay, so if we look at a map of Europe, okay, and I'm going to kind of go back here a couple slides. So Italy's down here. Italy was an Axis power at first under the leadership of the fascist leader Benito Mussolini. Okay, and Italy. Basically, Churchill was a big fan of trying to invade Italy as a good second front to open up on the Germans. He called it, like, Europe's soft underbelly, which it totally wasn't. Okay, so it was thought to be an easier second front, and actually the initial invasion of Italy goes really, really well. Operation Avalanche and then Operation Husky, which is kind of another part of it, like Sicily, Italy, it actually goes decently well, but then from that point on, Italy actually drops out of the war. They surrender. They switch sides just like they did in World War I. But from that point on, it just gets to turn out to be an incredibly bloody stalemate, and that's because Germany watching Italy now surrender, rushes in tons of troops and reinforcements to basically bottleneck the Allies. And the thing is that as they try to like push up the Italian peninsula, the Germans just make like line after line after line after line of like reinforcement points. And if you know anything about Italy, it's very mountainous and it's very easy to have things grind to a very, very slow, bloody halt. And so the Alps and other German lines of defense basically just like turn Italy into a very slow moving and not very dynamic second front. Okay, so that was not exactly the most successful thing, but it started out well, I guess. So there you go. First couple years of the war. Okay, from then on, in the rest of this lesson, we'll be looking at the mobilization of the home front and the effects on race and gender. But until next time, I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.